So I am joined by Mary Lou McDonald TD, the leader of Sinn Féin, of course, and the leader of the opposition. And it's a great pleasure to have you back as part of our Pride series. The Pride Parade itself is on Saturday, and of course this whole month there's been a build-up of various events. But I think, you know, it's both a celebration, and I suppose it's both, as it says on the tin, if you like. Pride is a protest as well, and Pride, it's about kind of celebrating our gains, but also, you know, how much further we have to go, and I suppose the challenges that arise in that context. But I'm going to start, I suppose, Mary Lou, by just informing our viewers that, I mean, you are a long-standing LGBT plus ally. I think that is fair to say. I recall going down O'Connell Street on one occasion, and I don't think you were leader of the party. I'm not sure you were a public figure, let's say, but I'm not sure what you might have been an MEP. But it was just you were there kind of on the side with the rest of the Dublin crowds, and you were just kind of cheering, you know.
With my kids.
With your kids, exactly. Your kids, I think, were quite young.
They were very small, yeah.
Absolutely, you remember the occasion.
I do, yeah.
So I think your bona fides there is clear. I think it's clear for all to see. I suppose I wanted to kind of preface kind of my remarks. We're going to get into a number of issues.
Sure.
But I'm going to start with one that it's absolutely is the most pressing issue for the community in a legislative sense, but also I think more broadly just on an everyday experience, and that's hate crime. It's of huge concern, I think, for the community. You saw I'm sure in recent days, we can't talk about them too much because they're before the courts, but there were alleged attacks in the Phoenix Park.
The Phoenix Park, yeah.
A number of gay men were targeted, and that's now a matter for the courts. But I think it's a reminder, if needed, just kind of as much as we've made progress, the daily reality, you know, the reality that a lot of our community still face. And I suppose, Mary Lou, there was controversy, if you like, when Sinn Féin said that they want the bill, the hate crime bill that's currently before the Oireachtas, that you were in favour of kind of scrapping that bill, that legislation, and that did cause concern and anxiety in the community. So could you perhaps maybe just give a little bit of context, or perhaps explain where the party is at on that really important issue?
Sure. So first of all, I'm really pleased to be with you. Thank you for having me, and it's great to be here in the Outhouse. I know this is just such a powerful hub for the whole community, and it's in the heart of my own constituency, I'm very proud to say. And you're right, I mean, we have been long-time allies of the community because, like you, we believe in equality, we believe in respect, we believe in the absolute integrity of people's identity, we believe in people's rights to live, to work, to move, to love, to enjoy freely without fear of attack. And so the issue of hate crime is very, very serious. I don't underestimate it for a moment. As a matter of fact, one of the last times that I was here in Outhouse talking to people, I was left in no doubt that people are fearful. People are fearful now going about the streets, fearful about coming into the city centre, which breaks my heart. Every person needs to feel free in their movements. Fearful now in the Phoenix Park. I did hear of this alleged incident. In fact, I was down for the Pride run. It was rainy, but it was great crack. And a lot of people were talking about that. And of course that instills fear. So just let me say, just as an abiding fixed position for us as Irish Republicans, it is to defend people's right to be who they are, to live openly and freely, and to move about without fear of harm or assault. So on the legislative piece, here's essentially what happened. On the one hand, there is no doubt that we need stronger law to protect people's safety. That's game, set and match. There's no question in my mind about that. The issue that arose was the balancing that essentially with freedom of speech. Now, I abhor things that are hateful, obnoxious, you know, vicious speech, but I also know in a democracy, the real test of freedom of speech is when you hear things you abhor and you still abhor them and you contradict them, but you allow an environment in which they are said. And we found ourselves, I'd be really honest with you, in a real dilemma, because on the one hand, we are absolutely adamant that the law has to be strengthened. Existing pieces on the statute book have to be strengthened to acknowledge the fact that people now feel less safe than they may have a number of years ago. On the one, so that needs to happen. Yes. And on the other hand, and you won't be surprised to hear from somebody who leads a party that was censored, that was politically censored for a long time, Section 31, that we have a concern around all of that. And this isn't just simply a historic concern. When I look, for example, to what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, and the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank, and you can see internationally the move to say, well, certain phrases from the river to the sea, challenging Zionism, expressing support for Palestine, is adjudged to be anti-Semitic. I don't accept, nothing could be further from the truth. And yet, be very clear, that's where in many jurisdictions that conversation is going. So, I suppose I'm trying to illustrate to you on we need to get the balance right. On the one hand, to protect people's safety, without a doubt. But freedom of speech is something that matters to all of us. It matters to the LGBTQI community as well. Yeah. We had hoped, the last time we spoke about this issue, actually, in a sense, a couple of years back.
To all of the parties, I suppose kind of it's kind of fatiguing almost at this point that hate crime kind of continues to be kind of, and of course legislation alone, it's part of a toolbox. It's part of a number of measures, but it is the baseline, in order to kind of, we can build then from there. I suppose the concern, and I absolutely take on board what you say, it is of paramount importance, I would say, that we get the balance right between, freedom of speech and then when you enter into the realm of extreme hate speech. And the community, I should say that we're part of the broader coalition against hate crime.
Sure.
There's 23 civil society organisations. And we would be very clear, I suppose, that our priority is that the legislation would be passed. However, we do understand that there are amendments could be proposed to strengthen it, and that's why we very much want to see it now going back into the Seanad. I suppose, Mary Lou, just talking to colleagues and talking to the wider community, I think what caught people very much off guard, and I suppose I feel a responsibility to talk for colleagues in this respect. It was a sense that, well, there was two elements to it, which I'm sure you'd like to address. The first was that it was just scrapped, hook, line and sinker, and there was no proposed alternative. So that kind of unnerved the community. Okay. In other words, that we're getting rid of this and that's the end of the matter. Whereas we're still then left, we're an outlier in Europe or an outlier in the Western world in having no, and I think it's important for the viewers to understand there's two elements to this. There's hate crime, which really shouldn't be controversial. Having hate crime,
and is not.
It's an outlier. It's a rather absurd kind of situation we find ourselves in that we don't have hate crime legislation. Do you understand that the hate speech, as it's called, aspect of it is the more contentious? But then let's bring that back into the Seanad and let's have those discussions but we very much, and I suppose speaking for the coalition in this area, we absolutely oppose scrapping the bill. We do believe this bill needs to be enacted and actually enacted as a priority.
And I hear that, and I understand exactly where you're coming from. So for the avoidance of doubt, there is no question as regards hate crime. There is absolutely no doubt. There are ways in which that can be done. I don't believe that you necessarily have to use this particular vehicle, this particular bill. There are ways in which you can amend existing legislation and use and create aggravating offences which bring it up significantly up the pecking order. I think that absolutely needs to happen. No argument there. On the speech bit is massively, massively complex, massively contentious. It wasn't helped by the fact, by the way, that government doesn't have a good record of working with people in common cause, unfortunately, on these matters. So if you want my honest view, I think that legislation is finished. I don't see any sign of it being reintroduced or resurrected. That's my political view.
Are you talking time frame there, Mary Lou? Are you talking?
I'm talking about, well, I'm reading the signals from government as well, and I think there is, because the hate speech piece is so complex, is contested, was not handled well, and because democratically freedom of speech is so fundamental, I think mixing the metaphors was not the right approach. Yeah. So all I can say now, I'm speculating, I probably shouldn't, on the actions or the thought processes of others.
Yes.
What I can tell you is that we accept absolutely the fundamental need for stronger laws to keep people safe, and not alone that, also for resources. Just in recent days, I mean, there's been the whole outcry around Natasha O'Brien.
Absolutely.
For example. She was in, I met with her today, she was in the Dáil, very brave young woman. She was challenging homophobia on the streets of her home city in Limerick. She then became the subject of a vicious, vicious attack. And what happened to her is a salutary lesson for all of us. She told me today that she actually found the experience of being in court that more traumatizing than the attack itself. Such was her experience of the complete disregard for the victim.
Which has caused national
and which has caused
angst.
an absolute outcry. And I think which raises again the really significant issue of getting the law right in its passage through the Oireachtas, getting the enforcement bit right and resourcing on Garda Síochána, but also relationships with communities and all of that
and
piece.
the training piece.
And the training, oh my God,
training. Now, of course, the
is so important.
Have their own definition, which is very useful. But there does need to be training. There does need to be more kind of engagement in terms of the role of the diversity officers that they have. That's a main focus. Whereas they're very spread now, of course, very spread thinly. But for the communities, and I think the Phoenix Park incidents, I think, were an example of where that diversity piece and that training piece is so important in terms of the engagement that happens. But I suppose we've outlined kind of our position.
And the courts, I was just going to say, and then the final bit is certainly you need that training for the Gardaí.
Yeah.
And bear in mind that speaks to a bigger resource demand for the Gardaí, which we just need to get on top of, government needs to get on top of. And then there's the issue of the court and the judicial system, because in some cases, you can get all of the piece right until it hits the court. And then if you have either lack of sentencing guidelines or lack of training for those on the bench, well then we can come a cropper. So we need to align all of those
points.
And
in fact, we've always said that this is multifaceted.
For
that
sure.
legislation alone is never a magic
the
wand.
panacea. No,
but
I accept
that. I do think it has to be, as I come back to the point, it does have to be the baseline. And for our community, and I understand, there's a critique of the bill, but it's important for our viewers to know as well that we already do have hate crime or hate speech. We don't have hate crime, but we have hate speech legislation. It's very outdated. It's very toothless. It doesn't take account of the online space in particular. So unfortunately, and I'm not accusing Sinn Féin of this, but I think more broadly in the noise, as I call it, because there is annoyance and there is anger actually in some respects that the voices of those who are most impacted by hate crime and by extreme hate speech, not offensive speech, not insulting speech, extreme, where you're inciting people to violence and you're inciting people to hate a protected characteristic, that those voices have been drowned out a little bit, and that there's been a lot of, let's say, kind of armchair commentators or people who are discussing this in a very abstract kind of format. Our community and our communities, the other minority communities, are clear that we do feel, I suppose, unprotected in the absence of this really important legislation. And we're not reinventing the wheel, as I said. And it's not to say the legislation is perfect. No bill is perfect. But there's been a lot of exaggeration and disinformation around the hate speech aspect, I would say that. Notwithstanding the concerns about getting the balance right, in the sense of what it does and what it does not do. You would think that for 35 years, we've had hate speech legislation on the books since 1989. But there's been very few of any. The courts will tell you, the Gardaí will tell you, it's ineffective. Anyway, but then certainly in the online age, it just doesn't take account of that.
And look, there's a whole piece of work, and again, this is complex because they are online spaces, and I see it, I hear it. I've been subjected to a little bit of it myself. I know exactly what that space looks like. It is hideous and toxic and nasty and hateful and divisive. So I'm not disputing for a second that we need to get on top of these issues, because the baseline is, when we boil it all down, whatever legislative mechanism we deploy, the bottom line is every single person, gay or straight, man or woman, black or white, has to feel safe in their lives, living their life, walking our streets. And that currently, as we speak, I accept, is not the case. So there are a number of things that need to happen. From my personal experience, and this is dealing with diverse communities, and in my own constituency, the most pressing issue, from my experience, is actually the issue of visibility and resourcing and relationships with the Gardaí.
You mean in the wider kind of the wider crime piece?
Yeah. No. But I also mean in the wider crime, but also specifically when it comes to gender-based violence and attacks on the LGBTQI community as well. That piece should not be underestimated for a sec. That's a game changer. Yes, the law has to be right. Yes, the laws in terms of hate crime need to be stronger. I'm not disputing that. But ultimately, you need to resource that piece as well. And the last thing, I look forward to having a conversation with you on a day where actually we can say, you know, the system has responded efficiently. I never like to hear that people think that their voice has been, you know, quelled or not heard.
There's just been a sense that because you go back to 2023 and the bill passed on a cross-party basis. It did. It passed, you know, in the Dáil, I think 110 votes to 14, something like that. And then there was a lot of, I would say, kind of part of this contrived culture war piece, where suddenly we had, like I'm very taken by certain, let's say, international voices, you know, who have kind of been very much up in arms about this. One bad actor in particular who would own a platform, you know, claiming that this will shut down free speech and all that, when, as I said, it's updating the law as it stands. And I find it peculiar you could say that those bad actors are very animated by our legislation, what we're doing here in Ireland, when you look at actually genuine gross violations of human rights. You look to Russia, what they're doing to the LGBT community there, you can look to the US, governors in Florida and places like that, and so they're very selective, I suppose, in their outrage. And I feel a lot of that fed into the disinformation between the Dáil and between the Seanad stages, because it's now stalled in the Seanad for over a year.
So, bottom line is this: we need to advance now a position whereby we increase the protections in terms of hate crime. We resource that, and we move to a position. And this is going to be an ongoing dialogue. I mean, anybody, I would not pretend for a moment. Actually, I wish I had the panacea, the magic, you know, solution to this question. I think human life being what it is, society being what it is, there will always be an ebb and a flow, and we will always have to be checking in with each other, updating, modernising, pressurising, protesting, as you say, so that people have the fun. It should be a fundamental right in a society.
And
that
as I said, your bona fides in supporting diverse communities is there to see. But just, I suppose, because for time reasons, what's Sinn Féin? I mean, are you clear that we do need hate crime legislation? I mean, that should be a given.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The question is the form of it, and I've been talking to colleagues. I mean, one of the suggestions is that you amend, for instance, the Offences Against the Person Act and other measures that are on the statute books to give more teeth, to give more beef, and to increase protections for named categories, named and protected under the equality legislation. So I'm concerned that we get it right, and I'm also concerned that we don't inadvertently, I'm not saying that people would do this deliberately, far from it, but that we don't inadvertently walk ourselves into a difficulty in respect of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And again, as I outlined earlier, I'm not making that point in an abstract way. I'm not making that point to be difficult,
no,
you know, or to create an obstruction. I'm making that point because genuinely, I believe for the health of all of us, all of community, the adherence to freedom of speech and respect for that as a building block in an open, democratic, fair, equal, respectful society is so important.
But you do understand the point, I suppose, where we're coming from, that we're not looking to kind of close down freedom of speech.
No, come here. I'm not laying that.
At all. For our community as well, that's something that's very important.
Well, that's my point.
But I'm convinced, because most, again, within Europe, most countries, we, in fact, as I said, the aforementioned 1989 Act, have a form of, there is no, even in the United States, really, there isn't an absolutist free speech. So it's about reaching that point, and I'm convinced the balance can be struck, where you go over a certain line where you're into incitement. You've gone beyond offence. And in fact, because freedom of speech concerns have been raised, I understand that part of the bill now does contain a free speech clause, defence, if you like. But I suppose just what you're saying about that's because it's the first now, it's obviously a proposal you're putting forward in terms of the offences against the person.
Yeah,
but I would just say, Mary Lou, that hate crime, and this is backed up by lived experience, but backed up by research as well, that it is important that when somebody is a victim of a hate crime, that it's not just that the sentence is enhanced, that crime in itself is recognised as a hate crime and is reported as such. So I would just have, I'm very open to hearing what you're proposing, but it's just important, and I would say to you and your colleagues, certainly if you're in government after the next election, that there has to be an acknowledgement that what is a hate crime is a hate crime.
Sure.
So cases that go through the courts, like what happened to, I don't want to prejudge what happened to the Phoenix Park, but cases like that, that's recorded. That's hugely important for the victim.
Yeah, no, and I'm absolutely appreciative of that. And in fact, the collection of data, sometimes it sounds like such a dry, uninspiring proposal, but data, having a view, having a record of exactly what has happened and to whom, and for tracking, I mentioned earlier on sentencing guidelines and so on, and whereas those of us in the Oireachtas, we have to be very respectful of the division of powers, but nonetheless, as a society, and I as an elected representative, I do want to know actually how all of this ends up in the courts. So the data collection for that, and as we speak, our data collection is awful. We are not recording anything in any kind of a thorough way, crime, and then categories within even a specific crime, subcategories of that, because all of that's really important information for the proper functioning of the whole system, but also for the confidence of society. Because I accept absolutely, for a young, gay or trans person, and or an older one, and they're looking on saying, well, this is all a very abstract kind of conversation. What's actually happening in the real world is this. And if you're not seeing a response or a reflection, or even just a basic acknowledgement and understanding of that, of course, that's very disempowering. So as a society, we need to have that level of surveillance.
That's the term you used, actually, that disempowerment, because I think there has been a sense that the voices of those most impacted have kind of been lost a little bit in this debate, and certainly we as advocates are doing our best, and some of the position indeed of for example, the coalition has been misconstrued a little bit, because obviously, as I said, all legislation can be made better, but our kind of starting principle, if you like, is that this legislation is passed. So I know.
And you've made that point. And you've made that point, and I have heard that point. And to be absolutely clear, the last thing I want anybody to feel is disempowered. I want your voices to be heard loud and clear, and I want us then, absolutely in a responsive way, to do our job to the very best of our ability to ensure safety, to ensure that hate crime is named and punished hard, and that we also, and I know you want this too, that we also respect and protect freedom of speech in our democratic system. And dare I say it, listen, Adam, neither you nor I are a threat to freedom of speech, or neither you or I have a cavalier attitude to people's safety and people in minority communities, far from it. But you have to get this system right, because you can never predict who's in government next or who holds the strings of power, and that's why
the threshold has to be appropriately
absolutely
high.
And that's why it might sound obtuse, it might sound theoretical, but it's only if you get something around something like freedom of speech, if you get it wrong unintentionally, later down the line you can pay a price for that, and neither of us, I'm sure, want that to happen.
Absolutely. So what would you say then, I suppose, to the community as we kind of conclude on this topic? What would you say to people who have felt that they were kind of, like, the words I have heard have been a little bit kind of U-turn, kind of flip-flop around the hate crime bill? Because there has been, I'm sure you've picked up on it, there has been backlash in the community.
Well, listen,
so your reassurance to the community, if you like.
And look, I know and respect people so much, and I know that there was a conversation around this legislation. It's been a long time in the making. There was toing and froing and all of that. But I suppose, by way of reassurance, I really want to reassure people that I have never, we have never, and I never will alter my position around an insistence on respect for people's identity, safety being at an absolute premium, and the law punishing harshly those who carry out violent, hateful acts against any member of the LGBTQI community. That's my position. That's immovable. That's not up for grabs.
And would you look to legislate, let's just say that there's a general election could be called, a new government, as I'm sure you're hoping to be leading. Is this an area that you would, if the legislation isn't passed, is it an area you would revisit?
Well, look, if the legislation, I believe that legislation is finished now. To be honest with you, but I also believe, and I'm firmly committed to the fact that we need to have stronger law to protect people from hate crime. There's no question there. The question arises: how do we do that? How do we best do that? And as I've said, colleagues of mine are currently working on proposals in that space. Yes. So can I just say, and there's a whole lot of ifs in this. Yeah. When the election happens, I hope that we will have a change of government. You won't be surprised to hear. I think we have a real opportunity to do something really quite unique and really progressive. But to reassure that in Sinn Féin you will always have allies and you will always have a listening ear. And even at moments where our analysis might not be exactly the same, or where we might not say this is exactly, have absolute agreement on things, you're always going to have a conversation, you're always going to have an ally in me.
And I've definitely heard you out, and I suppose it was important and incumbent upon myself, speaking for the representing in this context
absolutely.
the LGBT+
100%,
community.
Yeah.
We don't believe any legislation is perfect, but we are of the view, it's our very kind of considered view, that this legislation should be passed.
Sure.
And then just before briefly I kind of finish on this topic, many, there's a view put out there that Irish people believe this is woke, or this is how you could construe something of somebody being attacked for who they are, or targeted for who they are as woke. Or I've heard with the other parties talking about getting back to kind of bread and butter law and order issues. For us, this is actually an order. Safety on the streets is a law and order
Absolutely.
issue. It's nothing to do with wokeism or any of these kind of silly terms.
Yeah. See, I don't even buy into that term. I don't know what the hell that means. What I know is that I'm a person who believes in equality, in respect, in people's human rights, in living in a free, open, democratic society. And fundamental to that is the ability of every single citizen, without fear or impediment, to move freely, to live freely, to go about their work, to go about their enjoyment, unimpeded and certainly unthreatened and unharmed by another. To me, are they not the fundamentals of how we wish to live as a community and a society? Absolutely. Is that?
Which isn't an abstract term. It's at our peril. We kind of dismiss these issues as abstract.
For me, how I would describe them, probably as a Republican, I would say those are the elements and ingredients of what I call saoirse, freedom. That's what it is to be a free person, a free and equal citizen living in a republic.
Well, actually, that kind of does move us into another space. Sure. And I think that's kind of a follow-on from that, because you referenced democracy.
Sure.
And I think it's linked to the last topic we've just discussed, but this kind of proliferation of kind of online hate and online extremism, the far right in particular. And I think we're seeing the kind of the real world consequences of that. The Dublin riots, you have been subjected to this. I think women in particular get this online abuse. I think members of minority communities, LGBT+, anyone who's different, are just, there's an attempt really to kind of to chase us out of the public space and of the political space. Your party, other parties have seen this, and I would say that's actually a direct threat to democracy. If people feel they can't engage in the public sphere, if they can't put themselves forward for election and have that contest of ideas, we're in a very bad place. And I just thought you might want to speak to that as one of our leading politicians.
Sure. Well, let me say, first of all, we're getting chased nowhere. We are being chased nowhere. We live in a time, in an age where actually that contest of ideas has never been more important. It's never been more important to have a class analysis of the society that we live in, a global analysis of the world that we live in, an agenda that speaks to equality, to human rights, to the big challenge of the climate emergency and everything that means for us and for our children or for our grandchildren. There is no doubt there's parts of the online environment that are absolutely toxic, and that there has been a very planned, orchestrated and very, very intense attack on groups of people and on individuals. Of that there is no doubt. I think we have to revitalise, revive, re-energise, whatever the right word is, Adam, that conversation between each other. in the real world, if I can use that term, offline.
Seeping into the real
Yeah,
world.
yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
And we actually have to, now more than ever, is a time to be reaching out to each other, connecting with people, challenging things that are just wrong or mad. Like, I mean, I've been out canvassing in recent times, and I was very conscious of the fact that if you believed that like X or Twitter or whatever it's called was the real world, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. That's not the real world.
Yeah.
The real world is a much more complex space where people still, I believe, want to have the conversations, but I don't.
There's kind of that hateful minority.
Yeah, it's loud.
Their numbers
it's
are small.
overbearing.
I was going to say as well,
but they're
actually,
loud. Yeah.
In Ireland, and I think even broadly in Europe, the far right, and I don't want to dwell too much on that space, but I think it's important to note they didn't have the gains that were predicted, that were talked up, and in Ireland, really, they.
And can I tell you? Can I share with you? I'm not hugely surprised by that, and I don't want to play down for a second the phenomenon of, you know, that kind of toxic viciousness online. It's absolutely awful.
Let's call it what it is. Harassment, abuse. It's small, but for the person who's being harassed, for the person who's being on the street, because it's not, let's call it what it is, it's not protest. President Higgins, I think, said it very well. You know, and particularly because a lot of it is absolutely around immigration, but of course there's a crossover in terms of these, they're not protests, the targeting of libraries.
But listen, come here to me, all of the above, but when it came right down to it, and you actually went out and knocked the doors, you discovered, yes, you'd meet the odd person, but that was not the consistent position. Just to reassure ourselves, the Irish people haven't gone doolally overnight. We are still, for the most part, decent, good, well-intentioned, compassionate, and actually hospitable people. That is, and I think, and it's not to take away from the issues that we're discussing, Adam, because they're really important and they are real. Yeah. But I think we also have to remind ourselves and take strength from the fact that that's not representative of the vast majority of people.
We're still the Ireland that passed marriage equality overwhelmingly. We're still the Ireland that passed repeal overwhelmingly. And I suppose there's kind of...
And we're still the Ireland that love each other and like love our kids and want to have a happy environment and want people to have their best chance and to live their best lives. But I suppose that's ultimately the position of people that I meet, the vast majority.
And it's about striking that where you don't want to overstate kind of the role, but I also think that ignoring the extremists, ignoring the agitation
isn't the answer either. I know, I accept that.
And the community is very firmly of that view. That actually risks emboldening them.
Yeah.
And where required, I think there does need to be a very robust approach. Again, when it crosses over from protest, I mean, there's many protests we don't like, but I absolutely believe that's democracy. But when you have gallows outside Leinster House, when you have lynch mobs, you know, like we saw in the Dublin riots, and I'm using my language carefully now, but I mean, the Dublin riots got to that point where people who were different were afraid to go into the city centre, people of colour in particular. That certainly was a feature of the Dublin riots. I think we have to call it out, and I think we have to, whether legislation maybe plays a role. Do you think there is a role for legislation, Mary Lou, in terms of, like, I'm minded in terms of there's a bill going through the Oireachtas at the moment in terms of protesting outside politicians' houses, to ban that, for example? Now, I know that's only one class of people, politicians, but I'm keen to get your view on what's the legislative response, what's the criminal justice response?
So I mean, for me, again, the balance in all of this is, first of all, operationalising and making real the protections that we currently have. I mean, that for me, that's half our problem. On the issue of protest and protesting outside people's houses, politicians and others, I've had people outside my house many times. I don't particularly like it, but I also accept that we live in an open society, and I come back to the laws of unintended consequences. So if you say, well, you can't protest outside my house on a public, it's not so much that it's outside my house, it's that it's on a public thoroughfare. What's the knock-on consequential of that? I think we just need to think our way through it. I didn't particularly welcome the fact that people many times have been outside my home where I live with my husband and my children.
It's an expectation, I think, of privacy.
But equally, I would not cite that as in any way my priority concern when it comes to actually keeping the health and safety of our society alive.
So, for example,
for me, it's not the priority.
The targeting of libraries, which is abuse, which is people
Absolutely.
being called to the worst. This isn't unpleasant language. We're talking the most extreme kind of homophobia being used. I'm not going to repeat the terms, but it's way beyond unpleasant, and it's into the realm of intimidation.
Of course, and
outside asylum seeker centres where it's not just protest, it's intimidating.
Absolutely, and let me say, and I've said consistently from the get-go, and bear in mind there were some outside those very places holding posters of yours truly, right, very prominently. And let me just be very, very clear on that score, that being outside a place that is home to women, to children, to men who are in a vulnerable circumstance, that is not the answer to anything. That is absolutely not the answer to anything. And equally, you see, when you're a librarian and you're at work, that's your place of work. There's a health and safety concern. There's a dignity at work piece to this. And just to say again, Adam, there is no reasonable person that I know who actually thinks for a second that that's acceptable behaviour. It clearly is not.
And polls actually back that up.
Of course, and
people do want, topics, immigration. That's it is legitimate. That
so here's the.
But when it goes beyond the.
So here's the distinction.
Yeah.
The whole area of immigration policy, that's an issue of public policy.
Yes.
How to plan for it, what the rules-based system looks like, how that's applied. All of that is absolutely legitimate areas for public debate. It has to be debated. It has to be considered. Allied to that is the issue of resourcing within communities, support for all of those are legitimate areas. What is not legitimate is racism.
Yeah.
That's not on the cards. And I think we have to be increasingly clear in the distinction between those two things, because what you will meet out and about are lots of people who say, I'm not a racist at all, but I'm concerned. How are we managing this process? How are we integrating people? How are we resourcing all of that piece? And I think lots of people, we manage to cross a whole lot of wires, and then you got a kickback from some people saying, well, hold on, I'm asking questions. That doesn't mean I'm a racist, and I accept that. And then you have the agitators. Exactly. Then you have agitators and some people who are racist, who hold racist views, who dress this up as a concern about immigration. So I think it's really, really useful and necessary for us as activists now to kind of prize those two things apart and say, let's have the conversation about what works. So, for example, we don't support the EU Migration Pact for lots of different reasons. Others, that's legit, that's political debate.
Public discourse.
That's public discourse. What is not acceptable, and there is no dressing it up, is a racist abuse, racist harm, racial prejudice because of the colour of a person's skin, because of their ethnicity.
Censor, for example. I just think, again, he has a way with words, but President Michael D. Higgins, when he said they dress it up as protest, and he was talking in particular with World Book Day.
That's right.
And he was talking about the library.
The librarians, I heard
which
that.
Which again is of huge kind of concern to the community. It's a small number. They're not reflective at all of society. And in fact, I'm so pleased that at the galas we call it the Gay Oscars, just to lighten the mood for a moment. And we were delighted last year. It was an honour, in fact, that our People of the Year award, our overall award, went to librarians, because they were determined that they were not going to censor. The library is a space for everyone.
Absolutely.
And we're not going to get into the, censoring. Ireland had that experience before, we're not going back there. Nor are we going to have contrived culture wars coming into Ireland, copy and pasted from other jurisdictions. And when it gets to the point where when people are destroying books, and that's vigilantism, and the president called it vigilantism, and he's absolutely right.
Yeah, and obviously you're a great fan, as am I, of our great Uachtaráin. And absolutely. Look, I spoke earlier on in a different context about freedom of speech. Let's build this out now. Of course, that includes freedom of expression, creativity and thought, differences of perspective. Those things are the things that enrich. They drive learning and advancement and our entire culture. So for anybody who thinks that it is a wise or acceptable move to be censoring or burning books or coming in a heavy-handed way to say this book will not be in this library, my God almighty, that's the Ireland of what, the 1940s and 50s and before. We're way beyond that.
And we're not going back.
And here's the thing, as I said to you, like, we're not getting chased out of anywhere.
Yeah.
And the only way for Ireland is forward together in a thoughtful way, in a united way where we're talking to each other and we're arguing the bit over whatever the case may be, but we're not going backwards.
But there are parameters that you...
And if there are parameters.
We could talk about this kind of at length. So I'm going to, and it's always a pleasure, as I suppose, Mary Lou, to engage with you on these topics. Just maybe some of the more legislative issues, conversion practices. Now, I know your colleague, who will be part of the debate later on, Senator Fintan Moorfield, back in 2018, he had a bill to outlaw conversion practices. As I understand it now, there will also, the government are bringing that heads of bill forward, I think, are due to in this term. Are you very clear, because I know it's an All-Ireland issue actually, there's a big All-Ireland dimension to this. Your view on that? We need to
Yeah, we do. We absolutely need to deal with this, and at the core of this is respect for identity, respect for personhood, and the idea that you would attempt to convert somebody from who they are to dissuade them from the essence of their fundamental identity is dangerous and is unacceptable.
Yes.
And that's our position, north, south, east and west, morning, noon and night. So I think it's a good thing that I remember a time, and you'll remember better than me, than when the conversation around conversion therapy, it was kind of not a marginal thing, but it was not in the mainstream kind of political conversation.
Not as much as recent years.
Yeah, not as much as recent
years.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think there was a motion actually brought before the Assembly just in recent days. And this, of course, is an issue that had been controversial north of the border and so on, but I think we're landing on a position of consensus on that, and to me it's a common sense and a respectful position.
And again, I suppose because it can be subject in these kind of times we're living in, that's you can't have conversations anymore, a parent can't have a conversation with their child around gender identity or anything like that. I mean, let's be very clear here, it's not outlawing conversations, it's where the predetermined outcome is very much you can't be gay, you can't be trans.
Can I tell you?
So it's about that distinction as you refer to.
Come here, and look, in the reality of life, because we're all on a voyage, right? Yeah. We're all learning. Every day's a school day, for me at any rate. So we're every human being goes on a journey of discovering who they are.
Yeah.
And for most of us, that's going to take probably a lifetime to come to any definitive conclusion. So of course, children and young people need the support of their parents and people who love them and who want the best for them in the world. So let's not make any confusion there. This isn't about loving engagement and support for young people and others who are trying to figure things out.
Absolutely.
That's not the issue. No. The issue here is very, very different. The issue here is where there is a concerted effort to, as I would see it, bully or coerce a person away from the fundamental person that they are. We've no right to do that.
And it's
Everybody,
damaging, the research.
It's hugely.
To hear survivors, Mary Lou, like Jane Ozanne in Britain, for example. And actually, by the way, I should say, there are a number of jurisdictions who have done this already, and I would point to Canada, I would point to France, for example, as countries where I suppose it meets the requirements, if you like, that it's fully LGBT inclusive, so it doesn't leave anyone behind, any legislation that comes in. I'm reassured on that front. I think we'll do that. The second point is that there's no kind of opt-out on religious grounds, because a lot of it unfortunately happens in a religious setting, and then that there's no kind of consent. As survivors would say, if you have a consent in there, they on paper consented to this kind of so-called conversion therapy, but it was under duress of being thrown out of their religious community and all that. One jurisdiction we can look to not having best practice is what the Tories in England have been doing, which they made that a culture war issue, trying to play gay and lesbian people off against trans people.
Yeah,
and I think we should definitely look.
We need to learn. We need to learn from experience. We also need to apply common sense and common compassion. Do you know what I mean? I always believe if you're guided by those things And again, if you're listening to experience and if you're connected with people, you're not going to go too far. You're never going to go too far wrong on these things. It's, as you say, where people try to, because you see, as human beings, whoever we are, like wherever we, or however we define ourselves, we're human persons and we live, you know, we share the world and we share spaces, and people have, left to their own devices, in the absence of kind of malevolent forces, we've a way of kind of getting along with each other, and we've a way of finding answers. And I actually believe that the most fundamentally human instinct is actually to accommodate difference. I don't think the innate human response is to discriminate or to reject or to cast aside. I think those things are learned things. I think those are social contrivances.
Yes, and there's research
to be honest with you. So I think for us now in this society in which we live, I think the area, and this is why, you know, during Pride, the work that you do, I mean, you do it year long, but, you know, in this month, you know, these moments of conversation and challenge and exchange of views are so important, because that's what kind of keeps us right, because it keeps us connected.
Keeps us grounded, absolutely. But before we finish up shortly, in terms of the conversion, if that is not passed, let's say if political circumstances intervene and we have an election, would a Sinn Féin-led government, would one of the commitments to the LGBT plus community, would it be to outlaw conversion practices as we understand it?
Yes, that is our long-standing position. And the only thing that gets, and that you're getting into the detail of exactly what legislation looks like, there has to be a recognition of and a definition of what you mean by that. Yeah. So we talked about relationships between children and their parents, interventions as well that might be professional interventions where people are trying to figure things out and they're getting support. Yeah. So I think once we're kind of real and kind of, you know, that we have the full scope of that, absolutely. I do not and would never support, I think it's an appalling idea that you coerce anybody or bully anybody to not be who they are. I find that reprehensible.
The United Nations calls it a form of torture against the LGBT community, which it is. We could discuss so much more, but I would like to kind of, as we conclude this interview, what would be your message, I suppose, to the LGBT plus community as we gather to celebrate, but also, you know, Pride is a protest as well. What would you like to say as we conclude?
I would like to say, first of all, enjoy Pride. You know, let joy be the marker of this month for you. But also keep standing up for yourselves, keep standing together, and remember that you have allies. Remember, even though, and we've discussed some of the really challenging and even toxic, you know, vibes that are out there, those are the few. We are the many, and that is the few. I think that's so important. And remember also that there are many of us in political life in positions of leadership who will always want to have your back and who will always want to do right by you, and who at times you're going to have a difference of view with. And I hope that that's okay. I hope it's okay that we can have those conversations. When it comes right down to it, Pride for me, and that's why my small children, they used to, when Pride was much smaller, and they'd be there waving their flags saying, "What's this all about, Mammy?" For me, it has always been and remains a fundamental Irish value, a democratic value and a human value, that we are expansive and that we are welcoming and that you create space for everybody. Private space and public space as well.
The visibility piece.
The visibility piece is so important. So walk tall, walk proud, enjoy these moments because they belong to you, and thank you for allowing the rest of us to share it.
Well, on that note, Mary Lou McDonald TD, leader of Sinn Féin, leader of the opposition, thank you.
My pleasure.